All right, here we are. All right, everybody's here. All right, so let's see. Still in chapter 7. We're looking at taxes now. But before we start that, what I'd like to do is I did find a couple of more excellent videos that we can watch to help us understand how taxes and subsidies work. Last time we basically started looking at taxes on cigarettes, and so we're going to carry on with that discussion. And but first let's watch these two videos and then we'll dive in from there. So hold on one second. We'll start with this first one, subsidies. Now, a subsidy is the opposite of a tax. Actually, no, I'll tell you what, let's start with the taxes on producers. And because this is more or less what we're doing right now, a subsidy is actually the reverse of a tax. It's a payment from the government to typically a corporation, although sometimes it might go to consumers. You see a lot of this in agriculture. There's a lot of subsidies for farmers, for example, but and so subsidy is in effect a negative tax. So, but why don't we begin with the taxes on producers, and then we'll take it from there. All right, let's see. Here we go. I'll just post it here, and let's check it out. All right, is everyone just about done? Excellent. All right, so that was a pretty good job. He did a very good job of explaining what we were doing, and we'll go over it again, of course, and we'll look at the different scenarios under which different percentages of the taxes are paid by consumers and producers. You'll end up noticing, though, at the end that in every case there's some dead weight loss, but the question is how much of the tax is being paid by the consumer and how much by the producer. And like you said, it ultimately comes down to elasticities. All right, now the next video that we'd like to look at is a discussion about subsidies, which we haven't quite gotten to that yet, but we will very soon. And a subsidy, like I said, is essentially a reverse of a normal tax because instead of the government taking money away, the government pays money usually to a producer of a good. And there can be a lot of reasons for this. Sometimes the reasoning is that this industry needs help to survive. Maybe a lot of people would lose their jobs if it goes out of business. Maybe they feel that this industry needs protection for national security reasons. There's a lot of possible explanations for these. So let's just see what impact they have on producer and consumer surplus and if they do lead to dead weight loss. All right, let me get that one out. Hold on one second. Here we are. All right, let's check this out.
in progress.
All right. Are we just about done? Very good. All right. So you can see, oh, let me get this back on. So you can see that now the discussion about taxes we've already started to talk about, but the subsidies, as he mentions in the video, it's essentially the reverse of a tax. And then when a subsidy is provided, the job for the economist, of course, is to figure out who's actually benefiting from it and how much it's actually costing the taxpayers and how much deadweight loss results. Now, like you mentioned, in California, the cotton farmers are getting most of the benefit. And that's how subsidies come about, because you've got a small number of cotton farmers who tremendously benefit from the subsidy. But then you have a lot of consumers who end up paying the burden of the subsidy, but they may not even notice it because it doesn't really affect prices very much. So they may not even be aware of the fact that there is a subsidy. So they don't care if there's a subsidy or not. So the farmers get together and say, listen, we have to lobby Congress and make sure that they pass these subsidies because we benefit from it so much that we really have to have this to survive, or else maybe we just simply want the subsidies to have more profits. So basically, the side that has the most powerful incentive to pass the subsidies will lobby Congress and make sure that Congress passes those subsidies. Even though it comes at the expense of the consumer, the consumers may not even notice it because it will not have a huge impact on cotton prices. And so that's how this kind of thing happens, because you have an incentive from one group to pass legislation that might be ultimately counterproductive. But if it benefits that group far more than anybody else, they will push very hard to get it passed. So, you see a lot of very irrational laws on the books, and this has a lot to do with it. The people who wanted the laws passed had a very powerful incentive to get them passed, whereas the people who pay for the costs for that law don't really notice that this is going on. So anyway, so we'll go back and revisit our discussion about taxes. Now, taxes can be imposed directly on consumers or producers, but we're going to assume that we start out in this case with a tax on the producers of cigarettes, and we're going to see ultimately who pays the tax, or at least most of it, because typically the taxes are split between the producers and the consumers. It's very unusual that one side pays the entire tax. And then we'll also see that ultimately what determines the proportion that each side pays is, of course, elasticities, the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. I like the terminology, though, that they used in this video. Elasticity allows you to escape from something. In other words, what he's basically insinuating here is that when it comes to taxes, whichever side has the greatest elasticity ultimately ends up paying most of the tax. So that's a good way to think about it. Elasticity is an evader in the sense that whichever side has the greatest elasticity will end up paying the fewest taxes. But anyway, let's look at this graph that we have here. We have a lump sum tax on sellers of cigarettes. Now that means it's so much per pack. It's not a percentage of the total. It's a fixed amount. So we start out with equilibrium, where we have $15 a pack and 10 million packs are being sold. And so along comes the government and says, wouldn't it be nice to have a tax on cigarettes? And by the way, I do want to mention here that sometimes taxes are imposed on goods for the express intention. I'll just throw this in here somewhere. Sometimes taxes are imposed by the government, not necessarily to raise revenues, but to discourage the consumption of certain goods. The typical or classical examples of this would be tobacco and alcohol. You may or may not know. I mean, and again, it's hard to be sure because, when you buy a product, it doesn't have it written on the label anywhere. Like, by the way, 10% of this price is coming from taxes or 20%. It's not that easy to find out what proportion of a product's price is coming from taxes unless you're willing to do a lot of research. With gas, you might notice that if you look around at a gas station, what they often will do is there's information available on the pump, but it's printed usually in very small print, where they give you some sense of how much of that gas price is coming from taxes. It's not that difficult to find out how much tax you're paying on gas, but for cigarettes and alcohol, you'd have to do some serious research to find out how that's working. But the bottom line is there tends to be taxes on these types of goods. And in fact, in the past, they were often called, this is kind of interesting, as sin taxes, okay? Because, let's face it, you could think, depending on how you look at these things, as smoking and drinking as sins. And if that's the case, then the whole idea here is to prevent sin from taking place. So sometimes in the past, these have been referred to as sin taxes. But the bottom line here is that these taxes are not necessarily aimed at raising revenues, but instead just keeping the consumption of tobacco and alcohol down to a minimum. They're never going to come along and say, listen, you may not smoke at all. You may not drink at all. That would be going too far. But instead, what they can do is try to make it more costly to smoke and drink. And therefore, they're hoping that by doing that, that's exactly what will happen. Gas is a little bit different. I think with gas, what they're trying to do is, well, they're especially in the past when cars weren't as clean as they are now, gasoline is also taxed to hopefully reduce the amount of driving, which ideally would reduce highway deaths, or traffic deaths, I should say, and pollution. Okay, so in other words, the tax on gas isn't necessarily designed to raise a lot of money, although it may do exactly that. What they're trying to accomplish is, cut back on the amount of driving, because the thinking is that more driving leads to more pollution. Now, as far as that's concerned, most countries have much, much higher gas taxes than the United States. If you visit almost any European country, or really any country, when you come right down to it, the taxes that we pay on gas are quite low compared to the rest of the world. In fact, just for the fun of it, why don't we take a look and see if we can find a chart here. If you've ever traveled, you might notice that gas prices tend to be much, much higher in other countries. And it's partially because the US is now at the level of energy independence, but also it's because taxes in other countries on gas are quite high compared typically to the United States. So for example, we're down here somewhere at 53 cents a gallon. The average, the OECD is the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development. The average is 262. So look at this. In Britain, the tax is 344 a gallon. Turkey, well, wow, 432. Israel, 420. Where are we? So let's see. Let's look at some Germany, 329. There you go. Just imagine how expensive gas must be in Germany. How about France, 307? Is it really? Ooh, um, well, that's getting up there. But I suspect that it's even higher in some of these other countries. You know what we could do now? Why don't we see what the average price of gas is in these countries, not just the taxes. Let's see what we've got here. Gas prices around the world in March. Okay, here we go. Now the United States is, where are we? Oh my God, what's going on here? I wonder if they, oh, that's per liter. God, no wonder. I was going to say those numbers can't be right. All right, that's more like it. All right, so the United States is, well, where are we? Oh God, where are we? I can't find it. There it is. USA, $3.11. That sounds about right. Now let's come down here a little ways and look at some of these countries, like Italy, $6.97 a gallon. Ooh, that hurts. United Kingdom, $6.51. Germany, 6.41. Switzerland, 6.10. Where's France? Now, Norway is an interesting case. Look at Norway, 7.624. How's it so high? Norway actually has access to a huge deposit of oil in the North Sea. And so they actually have a lot of oil revenues, and yet they have astronomical gas prices. Now, why would they put such high taxes on gas when they are one of the world's biggest producers of oil? To stop people from driving. Exactly. They're basically saying, sure, go ahead, drive, but you're going to spend a lot of money if you expect to drive. We don't want you to drive. So therefore, the taxes are through the roof. Now, they'd never get away with that in the United States. Let's face it, this is a driving culture. And if any politician in the US said, listen, let's raise gas taxes to European levels, that individual would be voted out of office in no time flat. So you just don't get the public support for that in the United States. And that's why we continue to have relatively low gas taxes. Okay, because the political the popularity just isn't there. People in the U.S. love to drive, and it's a big country. We have plenty of room to drive. Countries like England, especially in cities like London, it's very crowded. There's very little room for cars, and so in London, believe it or not, there's actually a tax for driving into the city of London. What they do is they have cameras and they'll take a picture of your license plate. And so anytime you drive into London, you actually have to pay a tax. In fact, why don't we find out how much it is? How large is the tax on driving into London? Oh my God. 15 pounds. That's like 20, let's say $20. Imagine paying $20 just to drive into the city. And then oh, and then on top of that, if you try to park your car somewhere, um, ooh, yes, 42 pounds. So you figure 15 pounds to drive into the city, 42 pounds per day. That's 57 pounds, which is worth approximately 80 US dollars. 80 US dollars to drive into London and park there. Ouch. Yeah, that hurts. But it's the problem is that London is a relatively small city as far as uh, highway miles are concerned. In other words, let's face it, London is a very, very old city, and the streets are laid out in a very bizarre way. Those streets, a lot of them were originally paths followed by cows when they would walk around and graze. And so a lot of them are still exactly in the same position they always were. So let's just say the driving is a bit of a nightmare. And so What do? They charge you a fortune to drive into London. So that would be an example of a tax. Oh, and by the way, this price here is almost certainly the result of taxes as well. The tax coming into the city is designed for one purpose only, and that's to tell you don't think about driving into the city unless you have a lot of money to pay for it. So that falls into the same category. Taxes that are imposed to discourage consumption, tobacco, alcohol, and gasoline, and in London at least, driving into the city. Now, there have been proposals to do this in Manhattan, but so far it hasn't gotten anywhere. I think the politicians in New York City will find that that would be a sure way to get themselves voted out of office. People in the United States are not going to put up with that kind of thing. They just aren't. Okay. So anyway, by the way, you can tell if you're not sure how big these taxes are. If you've ever traveled abroad, you can actually, at an airport, you can go into what's called a duty-free shop, offers merchandise which does not have the normal taxes attached to it. Import taxes, these are. And again, the biggest items there would be tobacco and alcohol. But for some reason also, you know what's popular in those shops is perfumes. I don't know why perfumes would be heavily taxed, but apparently they are. So if you buy perfumes from foreign countries, you're going to pay a lot of taxes on it. That one, I don't know. I'm not so sure why the government would want to discourage perfume use, but certainly alcohol and tobacco are very important products in these duty-free shops. But anyway, let's get back to the diagram. And now you can thank your lucky stars if you have a car that you're not driving around in England or in France or in Germany. So the taxes are through the roof. But anyway, here's getting back to our discussion about cigarettes. So the tax, now this is what they were talking about in the video, the so-called wedge. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It's a vertical line that represents the size of the tax. Right here, this could be considered the wedge. If we're using the analogy of that video, that would be our wedge, okay? And it's a vertical line that represents the tax of $1.50 per pack. And so what happens is that the supply curve is considered to be down here now, or up here rather, because no matter how much the seller receives from the sale of the cigarettes, the seller actually sends a check to the government for $1.50 a pack. Okay, so in that sense, this is a tax on the seller. All right, in other words, the seller is the one who actually takes the money and sends it to the government. But if you notice, because the tax is higher, the supply curve is shifted to the left by exactly $1.50. The market price has gone up to $15.50. So that means that while they're paying $1.50, they're collecting $15.50. So the seller now collects $15.50 per pack, but and pays $1.50 tax for a net revenue of $14 a pack. And that's right here. In other words, this is what the seller now receives. We'll call it the seller's net revenue. So in other words, the seller is actually only losing $1 a pack. And you can also tell that the consumer side is easy. The consumer now pays $15.50 instead of $15. So clearly they're paying 50 cents out of the $1.50 tax. So the bottom line is that the tax is split. $1 is being paid by the seller and 50 cents is paid by the consumer. Now, what we can also do is figure out what happens to consumer and producer surplus. Let's see. All right, well, let's just quickly sketch that in here. What's happening now is that the new, originally, actually, I'm gonna have to make a copy of this in order to do this properly. All right. Oh boy. All right, I'm just gonna have to clean this up a little bit. Just to analyze the impact of consumer and producer surplus. There we go. Okay. So this is what I wanted to do. So originally, actually, I'll need two of these to do this properly. So initially, we start out when there was no tax. All right, let's say that this up here is our consumer surplus. And the producer surplus, let's say, was down here. And we can figure out the exact amounts by calculating 1/2 base times height. The base would have been everything out to 10. In other words, the base is here. The height would be here. Okay. Oh, I just realized, you know what? This graph doesn't show, oh boy. It doesn't show the intercept. You know what? Let's just say that the intercept is 30, just to keep it simple. All right, let's just say that right here, the vertical intercept was $30. All right. Otherwise, we cannot calculate the consumer surplus. All right, that looks right anyway. It's about halfway. $15 is halfway there. All right, let's run with that assumption. So then for up here, we would have had 1/2 base times height equals the same thing, basically. The base is 10 and the height is 15. And that's also 700 and, wait, no, it's not. It's 75. What am I doing? It's 75. So they're each at 75. Now, what happens as a result of the tax? Okay, so you can see, remember, consumer surplus is everything from the price line up to the demand curve. Producer surplus is everything from the price line down to the supply curve. Now, what happens when the tax is imposed? Good question. Okay, so, oh, by the way, yes, last thing, less detail, let's calculate the total surplus. And what we will probably see is that the total will go down, even after allowing for the tax revenues for the government. All right, so, oh, by the way, these are all in millions. It says right here millions. So this is actually 150 million. This is 75 million, and down here is also 75 million. Now, with the tax, the government collects $1.50 each for each of these packs, and we sell 9 million packs now. So all this yellow will be the tax revenue. Okay, so those are the taxes. This is a rectangle. So the base times the height is 9 times $1.50. Okay. That's going to be $13.50. Now, here we have $30. The new consumer surplus. Let's make that pink. Oh, this is kind of cool, this coloring. I kind of like that. Ooh, that looks nice. All right. So we've got consumer surplus. And again, it's a triangle, 1/2 base times height. 1/2, the base is now 9. The height is now 1450. So the new consumer surplus is 65.25. The new producer surplus is down here. Okay. So it's 1/2 base times height. 1/2, 9. The height is 14. Okay, and they end up with 63. So with total surplus, if you include the taxes, this is CS, sorry, right here, consumer surplus. The taxes have to be counted because that's revenue that the government can spend presumably on something useful. That's 65.25 plus 63 plus 13.50. What does that add up to? 65.25 plus 63 plus 13.50 is $141.75. Let's put that down here. So that's the new total surplus. Now, what was it before? Let me just highlight this a little so you can see it better. That means that we lost. Now, remember in the last graph, the total surplus, let's go back for a second, was 150. So the loss of total surplus is 150 minus 141.75, which is $8.25. This is what we mean by dead weight loss. Okay, dead weight loss. And on the graph, it appears here. So I'll just label that DW for DW loss, and that would be this area right here. Okay. So that's how the diagram works. So what ends up happening is that both sides lose, consumers and producers lose, taxes go up, and consumers, now the reason why there's dead weight loss is because consumers are paying a higher price for less units of the good, and the sellers are also receiving less revenues from selling fewer units of the good. They both want to produce and consume 10 million units, but they're not allowed to. The tax makes that impossible. Okay. All right, so let's jump ahead. And now let's consider what happens when the elasticities are different. In this case, it appears that the elasticities are more or less similar. If you notice, both sides lost a similar amount of total of surplus. What happens if there's a significant difference between the elasticities of supply and demand? Then who pays the tax? All right, that's what we want to consider next. So it turns out that, and this is what they were talking about in the video, with a high price elasticity of demand, consumers pay less taxes. The greater the price elasticity of supply, producers pay less taxes. All right, so low elasticity of demand means consumers pay most of the tax. Low elasticity of supply means producers pay most of the tax. All right, that's the way it works. High elasticity means you get to pay less. So if the elasticity of demand is low, you're going to pay a lot of the tax. If the elasticity of supply is very low, you are going to pay most of the tax. That's the way it works. And if you're not sure, you can think of an example, like for example, smokers. Let's face it, the reality is, smokers find it very difficult to quit. So the elasticity of demand for smoking would tend to be, or tobacco would tend to be very low. So when tobacco taxes go up, the consumers typically end up paying most of that tax. And it's because their elasticity of demand is very low. Okay. Now, let's take a look at some extreme examples then. Okay. So let's say the price elasticity of demand is 0. That would be the case of the vertical demand curve. Now, we're still looking here at the case of cigarettes. So the elasticity of demand, or I should say the price elasticity of demand is 0. You might recall we saw this earlier in the discussion about supply and demand. When the demand curve is vertical, remember, the price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in Q over the percentage change in P. If you notice, the quantity never changes. So therefore, this ratio is just 0. And so now when the supply curve shifts up, this is that wedge that they were talking about in the video of $1.50. Guess what happens to the market price of the tobacco or the cigarettes? It went up the full amount of $1.50 per pack. So the seller collects $16.50 per pack and pays the $1.50 tax. For a net revenue of $15. It's the same. Therefore, the entire tax is paid for by the consumer. Consumers now pay $16.50 instead of $15. So in other words, the entire $1.50 translates into a higher market price, which means that the consumer is actually paying the tax, all of it. because they are going to buy 10 million packs no matter what the price is in this case. Now, of course, that is an extreme case. It's not likely that it will work this way, but if it did, then they would end up paying the entire tax. All right, now, what about if it's the other way around? What if the demand is perfectly elastic, meaning it's infinite? Then we're going to have a horizontal demand curve. And you might recall from our discussion that a horizontal demand curve, let's look at it now. This is the case where the price elasticity of demand is infinite. Okay, so now when this curve, this is the wedge, by the way, the so-called wedge is the movie or video referred to it of $1.50. If you notice at the new intersection of the supply and demand curves, the seller is still collecting $15 a pack, but they're paying the tax. So you know what that means? Your net revenue is at $13.50. Whereas as far as the the market price is still $15, consumers are still paying $15. And so therefore, the entire tax is paid by the sellers, because the consumers will refuse to buy the product in this case, even if the price goes up a penny. Okay, that's how extreme this is. If the producers of the cigarettes try to raise the price even to $15.01, they'll lose 100% of their revenues, because the smokers will stop smoking altogether if the price goes up even a penny above $15. So now the sellers know this, and they say, listen, it's better to have $13.50 a pack than nothing. So they will go along with this, and they will just keep the price the same, and then they'll pay the tax. They'll be upset, but they get to keep some revenues compared to losing all of them. All right. Now, of course, in most cases, it doesn't really get this extreme, but the bottom line is with a very high elasticity of demand, then the seller is going to pay most or all of the tax. All right. So does that make sense to everyone? I hope. And what's nice about this is you can see it just by looking at the graph. It's not something you have to memorize, but I mean, when you stop and think about it, if people are that sensitive to prices, then the seller would have to be crazy to raise the price, even if there's a tax. Okay. So what this means then, I mean, when you logically then, let's think about this with a real world example. And this goes back to what we were looking at on the internet. So based on these results, if gas prices rise, or if gas taxes are increased, is the consumer or producer likely to pay the majority of the tax? Okay, so who wants to tell me their opinion on that one? Okay, well, you think about it. Now, the first thing to ask yourself is, the demand for gas is is it elastic or inelastic? Inelastic. Due to the lack. Oh, there we go. Somebody has it. Yes. That's right, highly inelastic due to the lack of substitutes. Therefore, with a gas tax, the consumer will ultimately pay most of the tax. Okay. Now, the demand for gas isn't vertical. It's not the case that there'll be no response at all to higher gas prices. Like here, for example, we're not quite in this extreme situation, but the demand curve would be very, very steep. And so the result of that would be the majority of the taxes, if not all of it, a very large percent is going to be paid for by the consumer. And the government knows that. And that's one of the reasons why they do put taxes on gas, because they're hoping to discourage you from driving. All right. Especially like you saw in Israel and in England and all these countries, they're trying very hard to minimize the amount of driving that's going on. And so that's why they have these taxes. Okay. Now, if we had let's say, what product is there with a very high, oh, how about this one? Suppose a new tax is imposed on, let's say, yachts. Well, all right. We have to be careful. I mean, if you're buying a yacht, you're probably so wealthy that you probably don't worry about the price very much. How about on cruises? Okay, now a lot of people go on cruises, even people who aren't terribly well off. It's not maybe as expensive as people generally realize, but a cruise could be considered to be a luxury item. Anyway, look at it, no matter who you are. Therefore, the price elasticity of demand is likely to be very high, the opposite of gas. Therefore, a new tax is likely to be paid, the majority of a new tax, I would say, is likely to be paid by the supplier, in other words, the cruise line, because they know if they raise their price to cover the tax, they could lose a lot of business. Because let's face it, I mean, if you're thinking about going on a cruise, there's so many other things you could do with your vacation besides going on a cruise. And, if the price goes up even 10%, then you might decide not to bother, because 10% of a cruise is a fairly large amount of money. So that's why if there's any taxes on cruise lines, and in fact, interestingly enough, I'll tell you what this is. One of the consequences of this, if you're at all familiar with the cruise industry, most of those ships are registered in foreign countries, like the Netherlands or Norway, because American taxes are quite high on these ships for some reason. So, and the cruise lines know that any taxes will ultimately be absorbed by the cruise line. So what they do is they locate themselves in countries where taxes are relatively low, because it's worth their while to do so. All right. Well, anyway, so now what about supply? Now, supply can have different elasticities as well. So let's look at this case where the supply curve is completely vertical. So the price elasticity of supply is 0. Actually, let me do this in black. Okay, so we have a normal demand curve, but the price elasticity is 0. Okay, so remember, therefore, the supplier pays the entire tax. Okay. So if the government comes along and says, listen, you're going to pay $1.50, there's the wedge. The supply curve being vertical means they're not able to produce any more of this product. We're stuck at 10 million. That's it. There's some reason why no more can ever be produced. So therefore, if the price goes up, they can't change the price because they have to be, the demand curve won't change. So therefore, this tax is entirely paid by the seller. All right. So in other words, the net revenue is $13.50, which is a loss of $1.50. Okay, now let's look at the other extreme case, the horizontal supply curve. Let me just make sure you're done with that, where the curve is flat, which again is something you don't really see in practice. So how about this case? Now here the price elasticity of supply is infinite. And based on what we've seen before, that would suggest, guess who's going to pay the tax? Yes, it actually means completely inelastic. Now, you might find that hard to believe, but I'll tell you what, there is actually a case where this can happen. Let me just mention this as an aside. When might we actually see an inelastic supply curve like that? A vertical supply curve means that the supply is perfectly inelastic. This could happen for a good for which it is impossible to produce any more of the good. For example, now this is an interesting one. As an example, the supply of Picassos is fixed. The elasticity of supply for Picassos is zero. No matter how high the price goes, no more Picassos will ever be produced because he's obviously gone. So you would have a vertical supply curve of Picassos that we only have so many and that's it. So therefore, if a tax is imposed on Picasso paintings, the sellers, meaning let's say the dealers who sell them, are going to have to pay that tax. But anyway, so yeah, it's very unusual, but it's not impossible. All right. Now here it's the other way around though. This, whatever this is, the supply is infinitely elastic. So here's the wedge, $1.50, and look what happens. The market price goes up by the full amount. Consumers are paying the entire tax. Okay, because if they refuse, if they say, listen, no, we'll pay, don't worry, we'll pay $16 for this product, then none will be produced. That's it. They can't have the product at all unless they pay the full tax. Okay, so again, that's obviously a very extreme case, but it does illustrate the fact that with a very high supply of elasticity, that means consumers will end up paying the majority of the tax, if not all of it. So that's how you can kind of tell. Like I said, that's why I think that gas example was a good one. And of course, this also explains, let me go back here for a second. One more good example. The fact that the elasticity of demand for cigarettes is very low, as you can imagine. This is why the government imposes such large taxes on them. They realize that consumers will pay most of the tax and will therefore, hopefully, smoke less. Okay. And so in other words, this is why the taxes are so high, because they know that the consumer is paying most of it. And if their goal is to reduce smoking, well, then this is, as far as they're concerned, one of the best ways to do it. by making it more difficult to afford the cigarettes, just like the tax on driving into London. Why would they have such a thing? Because they don't want people to drive into London. And they know that in a case like that, well, there is no supplier, I guess. So therefore, you have to pay the entire tax. So, like I said, a lot of these taxes that we're considering are designed not to raise so much revenues, although they might, really to sort of alter people's behavior. The same thing could be said for, pollution and things like that. The government may decide to stop pollution not by preventing it, by making it illegal, but by making it very expensive for the producers of the pollution, by imposing taxes on them. Okay, so this is actually a very complex area of study, and a lot of public policy is based on what we've seen here. Now, we haven't had a chance to consider the taxes that are directly imposed on the buyer, like, for example, sales tax. So we'll want to look at that, but sadly enough, it looks like we've run out of time today. In the meantime, I hope we're all working on our midterms, and you can start sending them to me whenever they're ready, and I'll probably correct them over the weekend. In the meantime, though, I guess we'll have to stop right here, and then I guess I'll just see you all then on Friday. All right. And now the next time you go to the pump, take a good hard look and see if you can figure out how much tax you're actually paying. It's not a huge amount by international standards. All right. So I'll see you all on Friday.